What if I told you that during one of the bloodiest revolutions in modern history, a ghost was seen walking among the dead? For centuries, her name has haunted the rivers and ruins of Latin America. La Llorona, the weeping woman, a myth, they said, a cautionary tale to scare children from wandering too close to the water. But from 1910 to 1920, during the Mexican Revolution, a conflict that left over 1 million people dead, something ancient returned. Soldiers, medics, and revolutionaries across battlefields and burned-out villages began reporting the same thing. A woman in white, weeping by the water, searching for her children. This wasn't a rumor. It was written in journals, whispered in trenches, and remembered long after the guns went silent. This is more than a ghost story. This is a forgotten truth buried beneath war, grief, and the desperate cry of a mother who never stopped searching. What if I told you that during one of the bloodiest revolutions in modern history, a ghost was seen walking among the dead? Her name is whispered in every Mexican household, La Llorona, the weeping woman. A figure older than the nation itself. For generations, her cries have echoed through riverbanks and dark alleys, a haunting lullaby mourning the children she lost or destroyed. Dismissed by many as myth, folklore, superstition. But war has a way of opening doors we were never meant to pass through. And during the years 1910 to 1920, when Mexico was ripping itself apart in a violent struggle for land, justice, and survival, La Llorona was seen, heard, documented. This isn't a ghost story designed to entertain. It's a series of first-hand accounts buried inside military field reports, medical journals, and survivor testimonies. Stories not told in history books. Stories too terrifying and too sacred to fully forget. These testimonies come from revolutionaries, officers, healers, and broken men caught in the machinery of history. And in each of their stories, she returns, she cries, she searches. The Mexican Revolution was no ordinary war. It was a slow-burning apocalypse, a decade of shifting alliances, betrayals, and broken promises. More than 1 million lives were lost, many of them civilians, women, and children. Entire villages were erased, families scattered like ash across desert winds. It was during this chaos that sightings of La Llorona surged. She didn't favor one side. She wasn't a spirit of vengeance. She was something older, something deeper, a manifestation of grief itself. Reports came from every corner of the country. A squad of soldiers near the Rio Conchos claimed they saw a woman in white appear across the river, motionless, glowing beneath the moonlight, just moments before a surprise attack. A doctor treating wounded men in a convent outside Mexico City swore she heard a woman sobbing near the canals every night, and one night saw her standing in the water, drenched, whispering about children she lost. A wounded cavalryman at the Battle of Celaya described being surrounded by 12 ghostly women, moving silently across the battlefield, touching the faces of the dead. One of them touched his shattered arm, and the pain vanished. These weren't isolated events. These were patterns, echoes, warnings. She was never seen twice by the same witness. She never spoke the same words, but she always appeared near water, always at night, and always searching for her children, mijos perdidos, my children, my lost little ones. Some said she was a curse, others said she was a blessing, but all agreed on one thing. She came where the dying screamed loudest and the grieving had no more tears left to shed. Folklorists and historians have tried to rationalize her. They say she is a colonial memory, a mix of Aztec mourning goddesses and Catholic guilt. They say she's a psychological reaction to trauma, a hallucination born from exhaustion, grief, and mass death. But what do you call something that keeps appearing across decades, across regions, to people who never met? You call it real. Maybe not real in the way science wants, but real enough to shatter sleep, real enough to make hardened men pray, real enough that entire squads would abandon posts, refuse to camp near rivers, and fall silent when the night wind shifted. This is not a legend. It is a shadow that walked into history. And the first man who tried to document her? A soldier named Captain Martin Lopez. His journal was recovered decades later, sealed in a leather pouch. Inside was a first-hand account of the night he heard the weeping woman across the river. The night his unit stopped laughing around the fire. The night something ancient answered their stories. That is where we begin. Because when La Llorona walks, it means something has already been lost. In the early hours of March 15th, 1914, just outside the battered town of Ojinaga in the northern state of Chihuahua, Captain Martin Lopez of Pancho Villa's Division of the North stood watch along the cold banks of the Rio Conchos. He was only 28, but already a veteran of countless skirmishes. He'd seen executions in courtyards, civilians caught in crossfire, and once ordered the burning of a hacienda that had been sheltering federal troops. He believed in the revolution, believed in justice, in land for the poor, in tearing down the rotten order that had ruled Mexico for too long. But that night, something he could not explain would challenge every conviction he held. The federales had been pushed out of the region, but there were whispers of a retreat forming near the border. Lopez and a 12-man unit were assigned to guard a shallow crossing point where the river ran low and treacherous. It was the kind of posting that bred boredom and superstition. They huddled around a dwindling fire, sharing leftover tortillas and ragged stories of home. The desert wind carried the howls of distant coyotes, but there was something heavier in the air that night, a silence beneath the sound. As soldiers often do in wartime, the conversation drifted toward legends. Sergeant Pablo Hernandez, a grizzled veteran from Durango, mentioned the tale his grandmother used to tell. La Llorona walks when the earth is soaked with sorrow. She comes for the children, drawn to places where mothers have lost everything. The younger men laughed nervously, but no one truly dismissed it. Not after everything they'd seen. One soldier, barely 18, crossed himself and asked, "Is she real, Sergeant?" "Real enough," Hernandez muttered. "Ask the villagers who heard her cry after the federales came last year. They still won't go near the creek." Lopez, rational and educated, tried to shake it off. He had no time for ghost stories. And yet, something in the river's stillness that night unnerved him. As the fire crackled lower, a sound drifted across the water. Faint at first, like a bird, maybe the wind. But then it grew stronger. It was a woman's voice, weeping, broken, calling out into the darkness. The fire died to embers as every soldier in the circle fell silent. Lopez sat up, straining to hear. The voice came from upstream, carried on the breeze. It was so full of grief it felt like a weight pressing on his chest. Several men stood, gripping rifles instinctively. Even Hernandez, usually unshakable, looked pale. The weeping grew louder, then clearer. "Ay, mis hijos perdidos. Oh, my children, my lost little ones." The men froze. Something about the voice didn't feel human. It echoed from everywhere and nowhere. Lopez ordered Hernandez and 2 others to investigate, rifles ready. But before they could move, the crying stopped. completely. No wind, no water. The entire desert seemed to hold its breath. Then she appeared. Across the river, on the far bank, a figure emerged, a woman in white. Long black hair spilling over her shoulders, she stood motionless, illuminated by the dying moonlight. Though it was too far to see her face, Lopez was certain she was staring directly at them. His mouth went dry. One of the younger soldiers whispered, "Santa Maria." The woman raised her arms to the sky and screamed, a sound so raw it ripped through the night like thunder made of sorrow. Several men collapsed to their knees, others wept without knowing why. It was not just a scream, it was every mother's grief condensed into one impossible note. Then she turned, drifting along the edge of the river. Her white dress never touched the ground. Her voice faded into the wind, but never fully disappeared. "Mijos, mijos, ¿dónde están mis hijos?" By morning, her footprints were found in the mud across the river, bare, human, singular. No other tracks nearby, as if she had stepped directly out of the void. Lopez never spoke of it again. Not in official reports, not to superiors. But every man in that unit remembered, and none of them ever camped near water again. We were trained to fear bullets, but nothing in this war ever made us feel as small as the sound of that woman crying in the dark. In the autumn of 1914, as the revolution shifted southward and the streets of Mexico City echoed with the rhythm of marching boots and revolutionary songs, a young physician named Dr. Carmen Vasquez set up a makeshift hospital in a crumbling convent near Xochimilco. Unlike most women of her time, Carmen had graduated from the National School of Medicine, one of the few formally trained female doctors in the country. She had given up a promising future in private practice to join the ranks of Emiliano Zapata, treating wounded Zapatistas in muddy fields under candlelight, often with little more than gauze and faith. The convent she occupied was centuries old. Its adobe walls had survived earthquakes, invasions, and now revolution. Surrounded by decaying gardens and echoing corridors, it felt more mausoleum than hospital, but it offered shelter, and the canals nearby provided fish and water for the wounded. In a war where everything collapsed, this place stood just barely intact. Late one night, Dr. Vasquez was performing surgery on a young soldier who had taken a federal bullet to the shoulder. It was delicate work. The metal had nicked an artery. Her assistant, Roberto, held the lantern steady as she worked, both of them soaked in sweat despite the cool air. Then, from somewhere beyond the convent walls, a voice began to sing. It was faint at first, barely audible beneath the soldiers' groans. Vasquez dismissed it as one of the men outside, humming a lullaby to himself. But the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was a woman's voice, gentle, melodic, filled with aching sadness. "Do you hear that?" Roberto whispered. "I do," she replied, still focused on stitching flesh. "But don't stop. We're almost there." The song turned into weeping, not sobbing, not hysteria, a quiet, endless kind of sorrow that seeped into the stones. As the blood was stanched and the wound closed, Vasquez realized her hands were trembling. Something was wrong. It was too quiet. The city, always full of distant gunfire and horses, had fallen utterly still. She stepped into the courtyard to breathe. The moon hung low over the canal, casting silver reflections on the dark water. And that's when she saw her, a woman, standing at the edge of the canal, white dress soaked, hair clinging to her back in long black sheets. She was bent forward, hands cupped, as if washing something invisible. Vasquez's instinct as a doctor kicked in. "Señora," she called. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The woman straightened and turned. Her face was too pale, like moonlight turned solid. Her eyes shimmered with grief centuries old, and her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was a wound. "Have you seen my children, doctor? They were playing here. I only looked away for a moment." Vasquez couldn't move. Her body locked. The woman continued, stepping forward without a sound. "The water took them. It always takes them. I've searched through every war, every city, and all I find are more dead children." The doctor noticed something impossible. The woman's dress was dripping, forming puddles on dry stone. Her hair, soaked, kept weeping water, but it hadn't rained in days. "This land bleeds with the tears of mothers. Can you heal such wounds, doctor?" Before Vasquez could answer, the woman began to fade, her form growing thinner, translucent. And as she stepped back toward the canal, 1,000 voices joined her, the cries of grieving women echoing across the water like a funeral dirge that belonged to the soul of the country. "Mis angelitos, mijos, come to me." Vasquez collapsed on the steps. She didn't remember falling. Morning light found her still there, unable to explain what she'd seen. In her journal, she later wrote, "I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe in pain that does not die. I believe in the echo of loss, and I believe I saw it that night, wearing the face of every mother war has forgotten." In April of 1915, the revolution reached its boiling point. The fields around the town of Celaya became the stage for one of the bloodiest battles in Mexican history. It was a fight that would shift the course of the entire war and leave thousands of bodies rotting beneath the sun. Lieutenant Candelario Cervantes, a young cavalry officer under Pancho Villa's Division of the North, was among the men who rode into that nightmare. He was born in Durango, raised on the back of a horse, and had followed Villa since the early campaigns. Like many of his generation, Cervantes believed in the cause: land for the poor, justice for the forgotten, a new Mexico free from the boot of the old regime. He had survived dozens of battles, but nothing, not even the siege of Zacatecas, prepared him for what awaited at Celaya. General Alvaro Obregón, commanding the opposing constitutionalists, had brought with him a modern form of warfare: barbed wire, trenches, machine guns modeled after those used in the First World War. Villa's cavalry, fast, fearless, and devastating in open combat, were slaughtered by the thousands. What was once a charge became a massacre. Cervantes rode into battle with over 400 men. By the end of the first day, fewer than 50 still breathed. His horse was shot from under him, his left arm shattered by gunfire. Crawling through the mud and blood, Cervantes tried to make his way back to friendly lines. But as night fell, he realized he wouldn't make it. He collapsed beside the corpse of a boy no older than 16, his eyes still wide open in death. The moon rose over the battlefield, a silver spotlight revealing a carpet of the dead, their weapons still clutched in rigid fingers. The silence was unbearable. Even the insects seemed too afraid to speak. That's when he heard them. Soft footsteps, dozens of them, moving without sound. At first, Cervantes thought it was scavengers, or worse, enemy troops. But as his vision adjusted, he saw them, women in white, walking slowly across the field of corpses, their faces hidden behind long dark hair, their bare feet untouched by the mud. They moved in silence, kneeling beside the fallen. One by one, they wept, not for show, not for performance. It was the quiet, endless crying of someone who has lost more than words can hold. I thought I was hallucinating, Cervantes wrote in his journal. I had lost blood. I was slipping in and out. But then, she came to me. One of the women broke from the group. She knelt beside the boy lying next to Cervantes. She gently closed the boy's eyes and whispered something that made Cervantes' blood run cold. Duérmete, mijo, your struggle is over. As her fingers touched the boy's face, his expression softened, almost peaceful. For a brief moment, he no longer looked like a soldier. He looked like the child he once was. Then she stood and turned to Cervantes. He wanted to speak, to cry, to scream, but she only looked at him, a gaze so heavy with sorrow it bent the air around her. She didn't come for me, he wrote. She came for the ones who would never return home. She reached out and placed her hand on his shattered arm. It felt cold but not lifeless. A strange calm washed over him. The pain, for the first time in hours, dulled. Then she walked away, joining the other women as they drifted between the dead. Together, their voices rose, a symphony of mourning, a dirge for a generation lost, and as the first light of dawn crept over the battlefield, they began to vanish one by one into the mist. When Cervantes was found the next morning by a Zapatista search team, he was barely alive, but his arm had been miraculously stabilized. He would carry the memory of that night for the rest of his life. Not just the carnage, but the women. I don't know if they were angels, ghosts, or something older than time, he later wrote. But I know what I saw. They didn't care what uniform we wore. To them, we were all someone's son. To understand why La Llorona haunted the battlefields of the Mexican Revolution, we have to look deeper, beyond the ghost story, beyond the crying woman in white, because what she represents is not just fear, not just loss. She is something older, something embedded in the spiritual DNA of Mexico. Folklorists believe La Llorona's roots stretch back to pre-Hispanic times, perhaps to the Aztec goddess Cihuacoatl, who was said to appear before great tragedy, weeping in the night. Others link her to Tonantzin, a mother deity later fused with Catholic imagery. Over time, this ancient archetype merged with colonial guilt, conquest trauma, and the story of a woman named Maria, a mother who, driven mad by betrayal, drowned her own children and was cursed to wander the earth forever in sorrow. But here's the truth. Legends evolve. They change shape to fit the wounds of each generation, and during the Mexican Revolution, a time when over 1 million people died, when entire families were torn apart and children vanished between bullets and borders, La Llorona became more than myth. She became memory. Reports of her appearance surged between 1910 and 1920, not as a monster, but as a presence, a whisper, a cry that mirrored the suffering of a fractured nation, from dusty trenches to abandoned convents, from remote riversides to blood-soaked fields. Her voice was heard. Her shadow was seen. She didn't come to harm. She came because no one else remembered the children. Historians have debated whether these sightings were hallucinations caused by trauma, grief, or exhaustion. And they might be right, in part. In war, the human mind stretches thin. Reality blurs. But sometimes, when a nation loses too much, it gives birth to something else, a collective spirit to carry the weight. La Llorona became that spirit. She wasn't a warning. She was an echo of mothers with empty arms, of fathers who buried sons without names, of communities left with only silence. She was the grief no politician addressed, the consequence no general admitted, and she didn't choose sides. She wept over Zapatistas and Federales alike, over peasant boys conscripted against their will. over children hiding beneath floorboards as soldiers lit their homes on fire. Her lament wasn't for justice. It was for what was lost in the pursuit of it. "Where are my children?" she cries. But maybe she's not just looking for her own. Maybe she's looking for the soul of the country. La Llorona is not just a horror story passed down to scare children into obedience. She's a mirror held up to history. She forces us to look, to remember, to reckon with what war takes and never gives back. And her legend has endured not because she's terrifying, but because she's true. Because every generation has its ghosts, its buried pain, its unanswered cries. Folklore is the wound speaking when the nation cannot. So yes, La Llorona walks beside rivers, but she also walks beside train tracks that carried the displaced, beside mass graves never found, inside homes where letters stopped arriving. She appears where memory is unbearable, and she stays until we listen. Some say the revolution ended in 1920, but those who still hear her know different. The revolution took what it promised to protect, and she is what remains. The Mexican Revolution officially ended in 1920 with the rise of Álvaro Obregón to the presidency. But no matter how many speeches were made, no matter how many monuments were built or textbooks rewritten, the war's deepest wounds remained unhealed. The political banners were folded, the guns were silenced. But La Llorona kept weeping. For decades after the revolution, her voice was still reported, heard on quiet riverbanks, near the ruins of burned villages, echoing down ravines that once ran red with blood, in oral histories, in whispered prayers, and in the memories passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. She survived, not as a myth, as a shadow, a reminder, a wound that learned to speak. Some claimed to see her near mass graves. Others swore her cry returned every time Mexico entered another season of violence or upheaval. And maybe they were right. Maybe her presence is less about the past and more about what we continue to carry. Because La Llorona is not just the ghost of one woman. She is the cry of everyone we never counted. The revolution took nearly 1 million lives, and most of them were not soldiers or politicians. They were civilians, farmers, wives, and yes, children. Her voice became the soundtrack of the aftermath, a sound that echoed when no one else dared speak. And she didn't vanish after the fighting stopped. She lingered, watching, weeping, waiting for someone to remember what justice cost. Folklorists recorded dozens of similar stories long after the revolution's so-called end. From Sonora to Veracruz, survivors described hearing weeping near rivers or seeing barefoot women walking roads that had long since been abandoned to dust. They weren't looking to terrify. They were looking to be heard. Grief that is not honored becomes a haunting. And the Mexico that emerged from the ashes of revolution was filled with both grief and silence. That silence became a kind of national scar, unspoken but ever present. And so La Llorona remained, not out of vengeance, but because the country never truly buried its dead, because there are cries in history that no peace treaty can silence. And if you listen closely, you'll hear her voice not only in old ghost stories, but in the tears of every mother searching for her son, every family displaced by violence, every child caught in the crossfire of politics and poverty. She was never about fear. She was always about remembering. The weeping woman appears today in street art, in literature, in films and viral videos. But for those who understand her origin, her image is not entertainment. It is a prayer disguised as a ghost, a ritual of mourning, a way to say what history books leave out. She exists wherever trauma goes unspoken, wherever violence becomes ordinary, wherever innocence is traded for ideology. And in that sense, she has never left. She walks the borders, where mothers weep for children lost in the desert. She waits near detention centers, beside canals, beneath bridges. Her cry is carried in lullabies that end too suddenly, in the pause before a siren, in the silence that follows news too painful to name. She is not legend, she is a mirror, and we are the ones being haunted. So if one night you hear weeping outside your window, if the air grows heavy and the wind carries a name you don't remember giving, don't be so quick to dismiss it as just a story, because La Llorona doesn't appear where people believe in her. She appears where people have forgotten what they lost.